Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last of our Live with Liz series here in October leading up to the election. It's been a great set of meetings, and we're capping it off with our guest, Mike Supina. Mike is a candidate for City Council here in Eagan. We'll be talking about how do we best work together? What are the priorities for the community we both are part of and both will be representing? And how do we make those things happen? So a conversation about both policy and process. Just as a reminder, we've also had sessions that highlighted healthcare with Lori Halverson, election security with Emma Greenman, and education with Cheryl Uakim. So those are all available on my website, lizryer.com, and on Facebook. So now, Mike, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, and then we can jump right in.
I'd love to do that. Thanks, Liz, for inviting me to this, and for and the rest of the folks that are on, and Hallie for being our technical support. So my name's Mike Supina. I've lived in Eagan now for over 27 years with my wife Gina, and we have 3 children. 2 are adults. One is a senior in high school over at Eastview High School. Although currently they're all living in the house because we're in a pandemic, and that's what happens. So, which has changed things a lot over the last 6 months. We went from being near empty nesters to going the exact opposite direction. But anyhow, been active in all kinds of things in Eagan. Most recently, president of Eagan Kickstart Rotary this past year that ended in Rotary year that ended in July. Volunteering for lots of organizations. I'm on the board of Artworks, which is great fun and just such a cool thing to have here in Eagan, and served on some advisory commissions for both the city and for the county. And now I'm interested in being on the city council. Actually, I ran in 2016, was unsuccessful, and decided I would give it another go now. This is my 5th call like this today. And the first 4 were with a classroom full of 6th graders. 4 different classrooms full of 6th graders. And boy, the first 2 were kind of a lot of fun and were pretty easy. The last 2, man, they were tough. I was like, hey, 6th graders, you're giving me a good practice for tonight. So they had some great questions. So it was fun talking to them. So now I get to talk to grownups. So that's fun.
We'll just see, right?
We'll just see
how we all behave.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that. You know, we've known each other for a long time through DFL things a bit, and I'm really excited that we'll get to work together because I'm an optimist. I believe that we're both going to be in the roles that we're choosing to be in. I know you've been running a very hardworking and thorough campaign, and so I have every confidence in the outcome, and I'm knocking on wood for you.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's I feel like I've been visible, so I'm just kind of working with that right now. So yeah, I feel pretty optimistic, but of course, city council, there's no polls out there, so we don't find out until November 3rd or 4th or 5th or whenever it is.
So we talked a little bit in advance of this meeting to talk about where were some common interests. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we were going to talk about policy and about process. And so I would like to kick it off with talking about where we can go as a city and what the needs are related to housing and transit, kind of the nuts and bolts, some of the real detail. And for me, something that I feel like has city, county, and state all over it in terms of getting a good plan.
Yeah, and that's a great place to start. And in fact, not to dwell on the 6th graders, but they asked me the same question. So, and in the first couple of sessions, Representative Halverson was on as well, not for all of them. So it was kind of nice because we could tag team talking about the different roles of the city and county and state, since she's a state representative now. But as far as housing goes, yeah, the way I explain how I'm looking at housing is Eagan is a net importer of commuters, and a lot of folks don't know that. And not just by a little bit. Eagan grows by 18,000 people every workday, from the number of people that live here to the number of people that are here, including those who work here. And it's great that we have all those jobs, that we're a job center. Recently, a lot of those jobs have been in retail, like for the new Central Park Commons and the premium outlets, places like that. And retail jobs notoriously don't pay as high as other types of jobs. So the question then is, okay, the folks that are working in these places, we have two options. Either we need to find a way to get them there with transit. Of course, some of them drive as well, but transit would be optimal. Or we need to find, they need a place to live near where they work. And those sorts of jobs, it's hard to afford to live in Eagan when you're working for a job that doesn't pay a whole lot. So that was a conversation that we had earlier today. And as a city, we can encourage workforce housing, and the city does to a pretty good extent. As a county, Dakota County, they through their CDA actually build housing, which is also kind of critical to having it be in convenient places. As far as how the funding happens, some of that we would rely on at the state level. So it's the perfect recipe where we need all three kind of working together and not being at odds with each other in order to produce the kind of housing that Eagan needs, for the workforce housing.
The phrase workforce housing is interesting because it's an evolution from affordable housing, which I'm guessing has maybe more of some baggage attached to it. Is that where the workforce? Because I heard that first.
I've used both. I tend to use them interchangeably. I think some people on here know, I'm by profession, I'm an architect, and I've designed it, affordable housing, as in some of the places where I've worked. In fact, I just went back and looked at some that I designed, 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago in California, when I lived out there after grad school. It was in Napa Valley, and it was for the folks that work in the grape in the vineyards, many of whom are immigrants, and got to design housing there. And I went back and it's looked online, it's still there, and it's great to see that it's still there and still occupied and still being used for the same purpose. I don't think we used that term back then, workforce housing, but it seems to be coming into vogue now. Personally, I don't have any issue with the term affordable housing, but words evolve, language evolves, and
yeah, I wonder if it triggers the NIMBY in some people, and this goes back a long time. When I worked at Blue Cross, claims processors, customer service reps couldn't afford to live in Eagan, and they, like retail workers, they still aren't greatly paid. And we have the problem of transit. We have issues with routes coming in, so the whole reverse commute, the import of workers, isn't aligned well with the transit routes and timing of the buses. So that some of those things, I think, are logistical and resource, not all necessarily having to have a major capital investment. So there might be something there that can be done.
Right, and transit is kind of tricky. I was actually talking recently to someone who still works for Dakota County, and she said transit ridership is falling, and that makes the argument hard to say we need to bring in more transit to certain areas if in total it's falling. Well, maybe part of the reason it's falling is because it's not going to the right place. Maybe if it's, and that of course takes, traffic engineers and transit engineers and demographic engineers to study and see where it needs to be going. But we have a transit hub right by the premium outlets. We have a transit hub right by Central Park Commons. We don't have transit hubs by every big job center in Eagan, and maybe that's something we should be looking at. I'm just going to do an aside here. If you hear something that sounds like hiccups, that's my dog dreaming about 6 feet away from me on the sofa. So it's not me.
Before we go into another topic, I would just want to see if Linda, John, or Ben, Hallie have a question or a topic you'd like to raise about the whole intersection of city and state governing or particular policy areas.
Well, I've got a question for you, Mike. And I mean, Liz will soon be our representative to replace Lori Halverson, and you'll be on the city council. And I'm just wondering, the legislature has become incredibly partisan and almost divisive. It doesn't seem like the city council has, but I'm just wondering what issues are sensitive at the city council level for the city of Eagan. Are there issues that are almost like partisan issues, or where there's a divide that we have to negotiate?
That's a really good question. To answer the first part of it, no, I know all of the council members and the mayor quite well, and I haven't seen any, at least as far as partisan issues go, it's not really an issue, which, you know, I will say is part of the reason why this is such an attractive thing for me, because, you know, I'm not sure I have the right disposition to be dealing with partisan rancor all the time. So in my first foray into elected politics, I'm very fine with working in a nonpartisan way, and the folks on the council now work together very well. I'll say there is at least one issue. I wouldn't call it, you know, it's never as rancorous as what you see in state government or federal government. But one issue that does appear to have a little bit of a divide, it has to do with the way land is used. So there's a lot of land in Eagan that's guided for commercial or industrial use, and those are uses that, you know, don't come along that frequently. And sometimes another developer will come in and say, hey, I want to build an apartment building on that land. But to do that, the city needs to change the land use, you know, and it has to go to the city council. Commercial and industrial uses typically generate much more property tax, you know, per lot or per unit of land, I guess I should say, per square foot, than residential does. And residential typically generates more in the way of city services than commercial industrial does, police calls or fire or other things like that. So there's a good argument to say we shouldn't be changing this land use willy-nilly, because that will, in the long run, reduce the potential property tax we can bring in and increase the amount of city services that we have to provide. So that's a good argument, and I understand that. There's folks on the other side that say, but if you have a piece of commercial industrial land that's been empty for 20 years and a developer wants to come in and build something else on there, maybe it's time to consider that, because nothing else has happened there in all that time, and it wasn't generating any property tax, you know. So so there does seem to be a little bit of a divide as far as that goes. I don't cleanly fall, I don't think, on one side or the other of that. To me, it's something that needs to be looked at as a case-by-case basis, just like when I was on the planning commission, things like that would come up and we would look at them on a case-by-case basis. So maybe that's me sounding like I'm waffling, but that's not something where I just want to do a blanket and say, well, we should always do it or we should never do it. To me, it has to do with what exactly the proposal is.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, good question. I'm just thinking. I was more interested in your background, Mike. But I think I think what you just said really interests me, in that you do it by case, you know, because it's not. I think being in the service of the government or being a government official, it's not a matter of cookie cutter type problems. It's a matter of being a judge in a way. Being the wise person among us to say, okay, what is good for this situation? What would be the right thing to do, or the one that would provide the most good for the citizens? So
Yeah, exactly. Highest and best use is a phrase that is used a lot. And honestly, I don't, I'm very aware of the level of government that I'm striving for here. I'm not trying to kind of become a U.S. senator or anything. This is Eagan City Council. There's few enough of these kind of things that are happening that we can easily evaluate them on a case by case basis. We don't need to have some sort of big overarching philosophy of how we look at these things. We can just look at them as they come up.
And I'm guessing that you'd be good, given your experience with Parks and Recreation, if you were to decide to fund or approve a development in a formerly commercial area, you'd also be thinking about the implications for needs for parks associated with it or connecting to other parks and so forth.
Right. And I was never on the Parks and Rec Advisory Commission though, but yes, that has come up when I was on the Planning Commission, that has come up on previous projects. Typically when there's a big development, either there has to be, there's what they call a park dedication. So either a portion of the land is dedicated as parkland, or more commonly, in lieu of that, the developer pays a certain amount of money that goes towards the city's fund for funding its parks. And often the city wants to do that because they don't want to have 100 tiny parks, scattered all over the place in places where people don't really need them. So they'd rather have the cash and use it for the parks that already exist. There are a few cases where there might be an adjacent park. I know there was one development that came up when I was on the Planning Commission that was right next door to soccer fields and softball fields. And it was right around the time I used to drive my kids to those same fields to play. And I was parking out in the neighborhood on the streets because there wasn't enough parking in there when the fields were all full up. And when that development happened, I said, wow, what a great opportunity to actually do a real land park dedication and expand this park. If for nothing else, just have a bigger parking lot, so we're not parking in the neighborhood where all the, where these folks live. I don't recall that the park dedication being part of that, although that happened right around the time I was leaving the Planning Commission. So it's possible there was some negotiation that happened after I had left, because I do see now that there's a little piece of land that's considered a park dedication that's undeveloped right now. So maybe they did end up dedicating a little bit to that park. But yeah, it's something that is part of every development that happens. They always talk about that.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and turns out also to Mike's, and that's about equity and inclusion and how we make sure the entire community is involved in a full, rich, meaningful way, and what that takes and where we are as a city and a state. One of the things that struck me, Mike, when we were talking about it was that the city is looking at some approaches and taking some action. So could you kind of talk about your vision for the city, and then I'll talk about how we can support each other?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to do that. I'll start with a little anecdote. Back in the spring, I was interviewing with the city council to be reappointed to the Energy and Environment Commission. It was slightly awkward because I was already a candidate for city council at the time. So I needed to go to the city council, some of whom I was running against, and say, hey, why don't you reappoint me to the Energy Environment Commission? It wasn't supposed to be that way, because normally you do the interviews in March or something like that before any candidate declares. But because of COVID, everything was delayed and it happened after. So it was awkward for me. Actually, the city council didn't care. They were just like, whatever, we'll interview you. So, and they did reappoint me. I'm on the Energy Environment Commission right now. I'm the secretary. But after that interview, I was chatting with one of the council members, and they said, for all of the commissions that we had interviews for, planning and energy environment and parks and airport relations, we had 18 applicants altogether, and not one of them was a person of color. And of course, the council member I was talking to was disappointed and maybe slightly ashamed about that. And there may be lots of reasons for that, and I'm not going to try and evaluate what all the reasons are why that might be the case. and some of them are reasons the city of Eagan can't control, especially since COVID probably or definitely has hit communities of color harder than the general, overall population. So there might be reasons right there why folks felt it wasn't a good time to apply for something like a volunteer position like this. But what the city can control is its own outreach. So that's something that they do well, I think. They make an attempt to do that. It's not something that the city ignores, but we can always do better. And that's something that I think the city has to do better at. As far as my vision for
Go
that,
ahead.
I was just going to say one thing that I've been proposing, and I think is already achieving some kind of traction with some folks on the council who I know, is a new advisory commission that I started out with the working title calling it Human Rights. Other places I know call it Equity Inclusion Advisory Commission. The language is important, but I'm not going to get hung up on that right now. I'm more interested in what it does. I know School District 196 just started their own Equity Inclusion Commission, which is awesome. I know other peer cities of ours, for example, Eden Prairie has had one for decades already. And I think it's time that Eagan gets something like that. And the vision I have for that, I actually wrote down some bullet points and I want to look at it and make sure I don't miss any, but the vision I had for that was to advise the council on matters of equity and inclusion, civil and human rights, accessibility and universal design, expand the circle of expertise and life experience that the city council can draw upon when it makes its decisions, highlight how women, BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities are an integral part of our community. Hopefully, the big hope is eventually this will become a pipeline, or maybe immediately become a pipeline into having a more diverse group of people involved in city government, not just in this commission, this new commission, but in all the commissions and in the city council and mayor and everything else. And lastly, just improve the quality of life for everybody in Eagan. So it's not just something like, let's do this thing for those guys. It's like, no, we're doing this thing for all of us, So that's kind of the vision I'm looking at. And I think that is something that really could happen.
And to me, that's great news, because what I've been hearing in talking to people and calling voters is that the way to be involved isn't clear and doesn't feel welcoming. And I've heard that from families of who have a person with a disability in their family, as well as communities of color, immigrant communities, other faith communities, that they don't really feel like their voice is heard. And so I think creating formal channels, but then also doing the work to build trusting relationships by following through on commitments and being active, not leaving it up to the communities themselves to take the initiative, is a really important step. So to me, that's a place where, as a representative, I don't think I can represent the district if I'm not doing that. And I think it overlaps just so perfectly with what you're talking about on behalf of the city. So that, to me, feels like there's a lot of power and potential synergy there.
Yeah, the city, when everybody is not involved in the city's business, the city is missing out, and not in a little way. We're missing out in an enormous way. So yeah, that's a gold mine that we need to be tapped into, because we as an entire city, because otherwise it's we're not living up to our potential.
Well, and it's on both ends of addressing an issue. It's on how you define the problem, because a problem looks different depending on your lived experience, and then the solutions look different. And so it's not just coming in and saying, well, we know we've got a problem, here are the solutions we're thinking about, help us make sure we have the right solutions. We have to do that at the beginning too, and defining the problems. And tech terms, it's like getting your requirements and really knowing them. But if you're not talking to everybody who's affected, you don't know all the requirements. And it's a very powerful process, and builds a lot of buy-in and a lot of opportunity for people to feel heard and engaged, especially when you start right up front.
Right. And I mean, just kind of as maybe a last comment on that, it's not lost to me that, I'm, 50 something year old white man that's kind of talking about this. I know that I'm already got here because of privilege, and so to me, it's not like, well, I'm going to go in and fix it. It's like, no, I want to just kind of set up the apparatus for this to get fixed, but we need everybody involved in fixing this problem that we have.
Yeah, I hear you. So that's a nice segue. I think we should take a few more minutes. It's 7:30, but we got a little bit of a late start. So segue into, what does it look like for us to work together? What does it look like for informal and informal ways for a city and a state and a county? Let's imagine, you, me, and Lori at all of our levels, bringing the county board, the state rep, and the city government together. Thoughts on that? And I'm really curious what others have seen work in terms of intergovernment cooperation, and what, horror stories there may have been on intergovernment cooperation, things to avoid. Because to me, it's, I need to know what the city wants. I need to know what the county wants in order to do my job, but I also want to be valuable back.
Right. And I'll talk a little bit, and then I'll let anyone who's on here, if they want to jump in. But well, first of all, no horror stories. So that's my first goal. If I can achieve that, I'll feel like I've already succeeded. Second of all is, we all have to, especially from the city standpoint, I have to always be cognizant of the fact that I can't be, freelancing it either. There's things that I want to see accomplished, but I'm part of a group of 5. And if I just run off and say, hey, this is what we want, and the rest of the council says, wait a second, we didn't agree to that, and then, so I will always be, when we do have any kind of formal or informal consultation, I'll, be cognizant of the fact that will be representative of the whole council, not just kind of going off on my own and saying what I want. That said, there's certain things that I want, as we talked about a little bit before. So that's my job to convince the rest of the council, if they're not already on board with that perhaps that's something they should be considering. As far as how we work together, though, I mean, I'm hoping, that it'll just be an open phone line. We can talk whenever we want. I know that'll be easier for me than for you, because for much of the year, you'll have availability. And then for 4 months out of the year, you're going to be in this whirlwind up at the state capitol, and having a phone call come in from Mike saying, hey, Liz, I have a question for you. Like, not now.
You'll always have a special place on my speed dial.
Right. And the same for Lori. And in fact, Lori probably is the one who has the most insight on how this would work, because she's already done it for 8 years. And she'll be doing it more as a county commissioner.
Yeah, and I want to make sure it's clear that I'm not talking about the 3 of us running off like cowboys on, representing our own group. That is very dysfunctional. So I'm talking about how do the levels work together, formally, informally, and I just used you and Lori as proxies.
Kind of stand-ins. Yes, I understand. Any other ideas out there, Linda or Ben or John or Hallie? What have you seen, or do you have any questions about that? I see John.
Well, I'm encouraged to hear just already at this point talking about keeping each other informed. I think that communication between the 3 different entities is so important, so that you can express. I mean, there's some things that need to be tweaked at the state level, and to have that open line of communication. Some things are more, are going to fall more into county government, and so I think that communication and sense of partnership and recognizing each other's roles, I think that's going to be a really valuable thing, because each of these 3 levels are very important and have their own unique roles, but still have ways that they support each other. So
Have you, Linda,
When
had
all those folks get along, I think that's much better.
Well, and I'd
you
throw
had
in the school
situations
district as
at your
well.
work or
Oh, sorry.
in your career where you've had to coordinate communication between groups like that?
Not necessarily. I used to do crime prevention work for the Minneapolis Police Department in another life about 30 years ago, and we would be working on state legislation and working with city council members, and sometimes perceived as working for city council members. And and then I remember dealing particularly on some housing challenges. And that was county funded stuff, and it was kind of surprising initially that as we got further into it, I, as this community organizer type position, um, kind of was the communication between the three areas, and there was often things that they didn't know. And I know at that time the one of the county commissioners said that they have the biggest budget in Hennepin County, but people have like the least awareness of how many functions the county board does. So that was really a case where, I mean, I, in my role, tried to keep others informed, and it really helped when we all got on the same page.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, Liz, you were going to say something and then I kind of stepped on you. And
I was just going to add in the school district as the other important partner in all of this. We think about couple of the pillars of my campaign are healthy communities and economic well-being. And each of those four areas have a role to play. When you think about even just like community schools, services available to meet the complete needs of families, regardless of their situation. That crosses over into county programs, it crosses into the nonprofit sector. But having all of the perspectives and the resources brought to bear in a coordinated way instead of as much fragmentation as we often see.
That, to me, that raises the issue of the state also has a lot of involvement in communities by purse strings and by making money available, whether they're state grants or whether it's the bonding bill. I know Lori was successful in getting something in that relating to Eagan this past session or two. And I know there's one other actor I just want to mention, that's the Met Council, and I don't know how actively involved they are with suburban communities these days. I suspect they still are in a significant way. My involvement when I worked for the state was to get a law passed for counties outside the 7-county area to get involved in water planning. And the idea we had was we wanted to have them involved in preemptively looking at issues before they got to be significant problems, to have them, instead of strictly being drainage entities for farmers, to think about water quality. And there was a parallel law that was passed a year or a two before the one I developed was passed in 1985. For stormwater management, and it was initiated through the Met Council. And my bill came with nearly $1 million, or we got it through a legislative funding body. I don't know that the metropolitan area had any money to provide incentives for communities to do stormwater planning, but so there's a role there, and that the legislature has in encouraging communities where there's a need across the state to do something a little bit differently than they've done it in the past. And you may need to provide an incentive with money or a framework with a planning requirement. And in the case of Eagan, that would probably come through the Met Council, but not necessarily. So it's something like if there's something in the human rights area or transit. Transit could be a funding thing flat out, but where the legislature can provide just the push needed, and Mike can tell you, Liz, what that push is and what they would love to have that push in this certain area, whether it's a policy push or a money push, that can really get the ball rolling sometimes.
Mhm.
Right, and having that relationship with our Met Council representative is important too. I know it had been Steve Chavez for the long time, and Steve Chavez actually was chairman of the Planning Commission when I was on it, of the City Planning Commission, and then he moved off of that to become our Met Council representative. Now it's Phil Sterner, I believe, is our at least the part that represents me. I don't know exactly where their boundaries are. Is our current Met Council representative. So, and he was, I believe, a former legislator.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Burnsville. He kind of knows, the system that Liz will be working in, of course. So.
Yeah.
Has a lot of experience. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's 22, so I think we'll wrap up here. But thank you all for attending. Mike, thank you for being our guest. We'll be putting this out on Facebook so that people can watch it in perpetuity. But we get quite a lot of viewing of these. I think it's been really helpful for people to just have these substantive discussions about policy and content areas. Mike,
You guys were great, but the sixth graders were a little tougher, I think, but they're tougher on me than you were. So thanks for that.
Right,
Well said. Well
I'm
said.
going to go practice being fiercer so that the next time I'm talking with Mike, I'm grilling him. All right. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.